Hi, everyone. Welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the causes of the American Revolution, and we did a little bit of that by investigating the effects of the French Indian War and looking at debt and the role that Great Britain's Parliament will take in trying to create greater control of the colonies in order to get money to pay off that debt. And today we're going to look probably at things that you're a little more familiar with in terms of the step-by-step process that's going to take us to what we call the American Revolution. So I've titled this The Beginning of the End, and the end being the point where we are no longer English colonists in America, but we are Americans. And that really begins with the Stamp Act. So again, going back to our last lecture, we want you to understand that for the colonists themselves, they had lived through this period of salutary neglect. You had at least 2 generations of people who seldom paid taxes. There was lots of smuggling going on. And so as we close out the French and Indian War and we begin to see things like the Currency Act, those acts are going to hold the colonists accountable in ways they haven't been for a very long time. And so with the Stamp Act, the colonists weren't being taxed any more than their counterparts in England were, but there had been
less in many ways.
Yes. But there had been such a long period of time, and there really hadn't been that level of direct taxation. So the Stamp Act is, many students kind of confuse exactly what it is. With the Stamp Act, Parliament wanted to collect money. When they decided to tax, they wanted to tax things that they knew the colonists used with regularity. And so they went after the item of paper because paper was something that was not made in the colonies. It was made in England. It then was shipped to the colonies. And so every piece of paper could have a stamp upon it saying it was a taxed item. So for that paper to leave a ship, the taxes would have to be paid to the customs agent. The cost of paper would go up. Each person who was using paper as a part of their business, whether they were a lawyer, a printer, who had a newspaper publishing business perhaps, those people then would raise their prices, and that would trickle down to the colonist who's buying the paper or paying for the legal documents that are being prepared by their attorney. They also taxed fun things as well, and we still do that, right? We tax things that are often vice related. So things like playing cards, dice, these were things that the colonists would have used, for entertainment. So these are the items being taxed because Parliament's convinced everybody's going to pay the tax, or most people are going to pay the tax, without considering that these actually may be items that one could boycott and not purchase and not use. And so it's 2 things at work: a system of taxation that's attempting to tax as many people as possible in the easiest fashion possible. And the fact is that they were taxing something that wasn't necessarily dependent on someone's livelihood. And so they were things that could be boycotted. So with the Stamp Act, we see a rise of an organization named the Sons of Liberty, which in some places was highly organized, other places a little bit less, and people may have just said they were a son of liberty, saying that they agreed with this idea of the boycott. But you will see mob violence ensue. You will see, particularly at the docks, customs agents being attacked, being tarred and feathered. That was a real thing. And you saw this typically in urban places. So, Wilmington, North Carolina, New York City, Boston, Massachusetts, Charleston. You probably would not see that in rural areas. But
peaceful protests?
Not, yes. But to be tarred and feathered was one kind of a ritual humiliation. It probably didn't kill people. It certainly could damage people, cause
like 3rd-degree burns all over your body.
Yes. But we do have a group of elite people in the colonies who will be tied to this Sons of Liberty organization. And they will be people like John Hancock, whose business was shipping. There will be people who are not necessarily elite in the sense of any kind of direct political power or income, but they may be people who are popular at where they live and have notoriety, somebody like Paul Revere. And those people are going to work together to not only encourage this mass resistance, but also sign and write what they call the Stamp Act Congress. So it's going to be a list of grievances that they write up that they send to Parliament. Parliament will repeal this act, in part because it destroys the paper industry in Great Britain. They depended on this export market to buy paper. And people just got creative. They reused letters. They went without newspapers. And the boycott was quite successful. The teapot that you see on your screen, this says no Stamp Act. The Stamp Act had nothing to do with tea, but if you wanted to demonstrate your resistance, right, and you think of the creative ways people do that right now on social media, in the 1760s, you could purchase a pot like this, have people over for tea, and they would understand your political views, and you could talk about that. The thing is, this was made in England. So some enterprising person in England understood that the colonists were unhappy and made these to sell. So the next time, you know, you're in Target and you buy a Che Guevara t-shirt or something like that, understand that this is capitalism at work, perhaps more than active resistance. But that is an object of the time period.
And as we're transitioning, I just want to point out that this wasn't a tremendous amount of tax, but this was, unlike the Sugar Act, very much in their colonist faces. And it's a larger swath of the population, not just the rich, but the middle classes as well. They're a part of this print culture. And I also want to point out that at this stage, the British do respond peacefully and listening to their concerns by removing this. But they still kept a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. And the other thing too is you saw that phrase, daughters of liberty. If you were a woman and you believed in these principles, you might just say to people you're a daughter of liberty. You might make a big show of the fact that you were no longer getting the daily newspaper, or you were reusing letters multiple times. So certainly women, not actively political in terms of voting, but certainly could socially communicate those values as well. So that phrase, no taxation without representation, that becomes the rallying cry. It seems, at least for a short period of time for the colonists, the Stamp Act got repealed, we were successful. But Parliament is going to tax the colonists. They just have to figure out a way to do it. So within days of repealing the Stamp Act, they do two things. They pass something called the Declaratory Act, which declares that Parliament has the authority to pass any law to regulate trade on the colonies, just in case the colonists didn't realize that that was their power, which is, I think, a little passive aggressive, right? And then you have what we call the Townshend Acts. Lord Townshend at the time was the head of the Exchequer. He'll go on to become the Prime Minister of Great Britain. But his vision was, you've got to tax everything in teeny amounts so people can't escape the tax. So this is where people start to really face, if they're going to boycott, they're going to have to change their lifestyles. Everything was manufactured in England. Glass was manufactured there. It was actually illegal to manufacture things like paint and glass and cloth in the colonies. So people, if they were going to buy these things, they were going to be paying the tax. They also went so far as Parliament said, we're going to have what we call Restraining Act, which was they were going to limit the power of colonial legislatures. So they did not want in the colonies for them to try to pass any kind of other local laws that allowed people to make these products, for instance, or would allow them to circumvent these taxes. And so you began to see people who were really invested in this idea of no taxation without representation. If they were not going to be represented in Parliament, then when their window got broken at the front of their house, they proudly did not replace it. They allowed the paint to peel outside of the door of their home. They would make sure they went without tea. And if you ever wondered why we have some parts of the world where people drink a lot of tea, and America has been known for a very long time as coffee drinkers. Part of that culturally begins in this time period. There will be quite an extensive period of time of about 20 years where there were a whole generation of people in the American colonies who don't drink tea, and in some cases don't ever go back. But that idea of representation is key to all of this. So yes, the colonists are, and again, you could have an average colonist saying, I believe in this principle. What kind of political action that really is going to mean for them, who knows? But certainly for the elites, for the very wealthy, for the people who were this educated class of Harvard attorneys, for people who were in finance, shipping, they felt they were entitled to be part of the decision making, and they are going to definitely be leaders of this revolutionary movement.
And it's important to keep in mind, again, with we covered this in the last lesson, but like no representation. I mean, at this point in England, only about 2 or 3% of the population are eligible to vote for representatives in the House of Commons, let alone the House of Lords, which was not and still is not elected. So it's not like we were missing out on this wonderful democracy, but we were not able to participate in the oligarchy.
So I find that this picture is one that students are usually familiar with, and it is a wonderful piece of propaganda. It's great. When you look at that picture, you see that the lobster backs are all firing simultaneously on this poor crowd of people. And although there's a moon in the upper left-hand corner of our picture, it looks like it's broad daylight. I mean, there's a dog, Mr. Haregrove, a poor little dog has been caught up in this tragedy, this bloody massacre, which was the events of the Boston Massacre of 1770. So from the
that
time
was like Captain Preston, is that right?
Yes.
The captain giving the order.
Giving the order. These people did go to trial, and what is this scenario was never proven to actually be the circumstances. So people were shot, people were killed.
And John Adams was their lawyer. I just want to point out, he was their lawyer and got them acquitted. I think a few of them got like a few brands on their arm, but I mean, no.
On the cheek.
Oh, he's on the cheek. Okay.
On the cheek, you got branded, and I think it was 2 of them. So, but this scenario, this did happen, but it didn't happen in broad daylight. It was not both men and women, young children, and a dog that barely comes out unscathed. The events of the Boston Massacre happened in March of 1770, and after 3 years of protest and boycott, you had a situation in the city of Boston that probably gave itself over to what would become these events. So the Customs House in Boston was a place where items that were waiting to be sold that had been unloaded from ships. They also held monies there that had been collected, and it was well guarded actually by the soldiers who were involved in this incident. It also happened to be across the street from a very large public house, or what we would call a bar today. And on a cold night, the patrons, many of whom had been drinking through much of the day, and many of them were dock workers, people who were in the area on a daily basis, they got turned out. The publican locked his doors and they were out on the street. And we believe that they began by throwing ice and snow and eventually bottles and rocks. And a shot was fired by one of the British soldiers, and other shots were fired as well. And in the end, 4 people were killed. An African-American gentleman named Crispus Attucks was killed on that night. And it will be a moment that will be able to galvanize the public imagination due to pictures like these. So this one was produced by Paul Revere. So not only was he a great silversmith, but he also did a lot of artwork for publishing. He was an engraver. And this piece in particular was very useful in eliciting public sympathy for the colonists. So even people who might not have been doing any kind of active protesting and maybe not boycotting, now their perspective, regardless of where they live in the colonies, and this became a reproduced piece throughout the colonies, they certainly began to see this as, wow, this is tyranny. You have, the government is killing people. who are protesting. And yes, the event itself is a little more nuanced, but the way the public perceives things is very powerful, and it will galvanize quite a bit of support. Because of the Boston Massacre, Parliament feels that they have to end the Townsend Acts, that they are in a position where they are not going to be able to collect this tax effectively, and that this situation has gone too far. And so they make an agreement to repeal it. That doesn't mean there aren't more taxes to come, but there will be a short period of dormancy where there is not this level of direct taxation.
And again, I think a lot of this, and going back to the Declaratory Act, a lot of this was for them about the symbolism of just because we're being nice doesn't mean that we have to be. So we have to show that we have the legitimacy, the sovereignty over these colonies.
Yes. If you can go back one slide for me.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. All right, and then you go, sorry. So one of the things that it's important, Mr. Hargroves talked about this publishing culture, this printing culture in the colonies. You also had a culture of people who wrote. You had a much higher rate of literacy amongst peoples, both rich and poor, in colonial America than you did back in England. And part of that comes from the religious tradition. Most Protestant churches believed that teaching literacy made it possible for individuals to receive the word of God. So you might be a backcountry farmer, but probably at least one adult in the household could read, probably encouraged others to read, even if it was just the Bible, Poor Richard's Almanac, maybe a local paper that you got, once a month. But this is a literate culture. This is a culture also throughout the Enlightenment era. They're writers. I don't like something, I'm going to write about it. And I'm going to rationalize why I am right, why this powerful force of Great Britain is wrong. So you do see that letter writing as a part of the culture is also going to be part of our resistance movement. So the gentleman who's in the lower part of our screen, that's Samuel Adams. He was a cousin of John's. He will be integral in what is known as the Committees of Correspondence. And these will be groups of people who knew each other in various colonies, and they were constantly writing. And part of the reason they were writing is that over time, you began to see newspapers that had a particular, perhaps, political bent. So they might be more loyalist, or they might be seen as being more pro-colonist and anti-tax. Some newspapers are going to be shut down in some areas, particularly where the local authorities, the governor, is able to do that. And so to kind of circumvent that lack of media in some places, the committees of correspondence are going to make sure that they're constantly telling what's going on. And also giving people updates. If I lived in a port city, I think it would be interesting to know that 2,000 British soldiers arrived today in Boston. And I want every single person in every other colony to know that. So this was a way of communicating. And you will see that really this is in some ways how they're going to be able to be united in different places. It doesn't mean every colonist was looking for revolution, but it is how elites are going to be able to stay connected and build this revolutionary movement over time. There are going to be some things that also the British government is going to use, as Mr. Hargrove was just saying, to sanction their point of view. They are going to, throughout this period, show their own audiences and newspapers at home what they see as the violent mob mentality. They want to make it clear to other Englishmen that this is not a resistance movement on principle. This is violence, and it is something that has to be stopped.
Anarchist jurisdiction?
Yes, yes. You're also going to see that there are some events that perhaps don't have a kind of a legitimate explanation to them. So there was a ship called the Gaspee that ran aground off the coast of Rhode Island. It was a ship full of cargo that was of taxable items. It ran aground, and a group of people who said they were part of the Sons of Liberty, whatever that might mean, went and took over the ship. They looted valuables from it and burned it. And that was another item that the British government could use as propaganda and say, look, they destroy other people's property. That the person who owns that ship, the people who made that cargo, they're out of money now. They've lost the value of their investment because it's out of control in those colonies. So they did use, on both sides, you see kind of warring propaganda going back and forth. The Tea Act, so we will see that there is going to be an item that Parliament believes they can tax and the colonists won't mind. And why? Because the colonists consumed, by their number, actually more tea than people in England. They've said more disposable income, I suppose, but they loved tea, they drank lots of tea, but there were two different tea monopolies globally at that time. There was the Dutch East India Company, and there was the East India Tea Company, which was Great Britain's monopoly. And it seemed that the colonists liked Dutch tea better than they liked that which they were supposed to get from the East India Tea Company. And so, again, because this is a monopoly that has a parliamentary charter, it's got funding from the British government, the agreement is made that only East India tea can be sold in the colonies. And there's going to be a little tax put on it, but actually the price of the tea was subsidized. So it became cheaper than Dutch tea, even if it was going to be a loss of revenue over the long haul. But the
colonists upset. That sounds amazing. Cheap
but it's
tea?
a tax. There's a tax and there's still no representation.
And also, who are they cutting out? All those smugglers. They're undercutting smugglers.
Yes. So how is that Dutch tea getting in? Well, it's getting in with people like John Hancock, right? Who now are not going to be able to do that in the same way. But yes, although it wasn't that English tea became more expensive, it actually became cheaper, but the colonists couldn't buy anything else. And the principle was they were still taxed without representation. That's what gives rise to the Boston Tea Party. All that tea that gets dumped into Boston Harbor, that belonged to the East India Tea Company, and it belonged to the owners of the ship, and it was a loss of money. And it will become the item which Parliament definitely will feel this is the point, this is the line that we have drawn, and we are now going to hold the city of Boston accountable.
So I almost, when I think about this, I almost think about, like, imagine if you're in a classroom that, you know, you had a teacher for a long time that was just completely lax and kids got to kind of do whatever they want. And then a teacher finally comes in, a new teacher, and is like, okay, here are the rules. And it's like, it's not necessarily that the rules are fundamentally unfair. Maybe they are somewhat unfair, but it's that you had all of that chaos beforehand that the reaction to it became so pronounced. And in this case, I would say it was a little bit of an overreaction. This is where Parliament changes their tact, and where they're suddenly changing it to saying, okay, never mind, no more Mr. Nice Guy. And so one thing they did was they sent a series of acts, one after another. One of them was boycotting the port of Boston. This is a major port, and saying, you're not going to get any more ships until you pay back the tea. Who's paying back the tea? Everybody's got to pay back that tea. So they weren't able to identify the individuals involved, not because of their very amazing costumes. No one believed it was Native Americans that was dumping the tea, but they said, okay, we're punishing everybody. So again, going to our class analogy, imagine it was like two kids that were acting up, but everybody's got to write an essay for homework, right? And so suddenly you start to have some of the people in the city of Boston who were kind of on the edge, like, I don't know, these guys are kind of anarchist and they're destroying things. But hey, now suddenly the reaction to what was done, the British reaction is worse than what some of those Sons of Liberty had done. And so it caused some people who were kind of on the fence to begin to align themselves a little bit more with these Sons of Liberty. And one thing that further escalated this was the Quartering Act of 1774. So you remember, from the aftermath of the French Union War, the British soldiers didn't all go home. And they stayed in the colonies. And so this became even more escalated, where the British, to help enforce all of these taxes and customs, were not going to just leave their customs agents there undefended, that they were going to make sure that they had their soldiers that were occupying. And by some estimates, the population of Boston at this time was about like 1/3 soldiers. It was a lot of soldiers that were there. It was basically a city under occupation. And who had to pay for that occupation? The colonists, because it's for their benefit, right? We're giving you nice security and protecting the frontier. You got to pay for the soldiers there. And so that became a harsh thing. With the Justice Act, this was where, instead of having necessarily supreme authority over with their judiciary, that the British reserved the right to be able to conduct and control trials. So even when we got to the Boston Massacre, that was tried in the colonies. They didn't ship those soldiers home to be acquitted. They were tried, and there was, even though it was proved that they didn't do it out of malice, there were some repercussions for some of those people. I would say in the end, that was a pretty fair trial. But even then, now they're saying, no, ultimate authority over the judiciary is with us. Mm-hmm. So do you mind talking a little bit about the Quebec Act?
Sure. And just with the Justice Act, consider, you probably learned back in civics, the importance of habeas corpus, that there are warrants when you do a search. The Justice Act is saying, none of that is necessary. We can, the British government can basically be the investigators and the jury and the judge, and it can happen outside the colony. So yes, I mean, this was just absolutely transformative from the jurisprudence that had existed before.
Reminds me a lot of what's going on in Hong Kong right now.
Yes, yes. I would say there's
that's
some
the comparative government.
Yes, absolutely. So with the Quebec Act, the royal colonies were all Church of England. That was the established church. That's where money was tithed to. With the Quebec Act, people who lived in Quebec, so this French territory that had been taken over as a part of the Treaty of Paris of 1763, they didn't have to pay tax to the Church of England. They could continue to be Catholic, and they could put their tithe, their money, to the Catholic Church. And for some of our colonists who were anti-Catholic, and at that time, many people who were Protestant probably had a vision of Catholicism as being something that was not really English, that it was something that was foreign influenced. So there was sort of an element of anti-Catholicism that existed. And there were people who said, well, wait, I don't understand this. You're not making them pay a tax, and they're a different religion, but I've got to pay a tax on tea. And so again, it was just seen as unfair.
And I think it is telling that, we'll get to this more next class, but that one of the very first things that this new, Continental Army does is invade Quebec. Even they got started even before they had declared independence. And for some reason, they didn't want to join up with us against the British. They were like, no, we don't really like you guys. So just so you guys know, we tried to invade Canada twice and we lost twice. And next time you make fun of the Canadians, we're 0 for 2. So anyway, the First Continental Congress, this meets in 1774. And I just want to juxtapose this with like the Albany Plan of Union, and then seeing the Stamp Act Congress. And this is part of a progression where early on, they were like, we don't really have anything to do with each other. Why would we even join together? I'm a Virginian, I'm a Bostonian. I mean, we're like separate species, right? In this case, there had suddenly been enough. And there had been all these connections through newspapers, through correspondence, that people were seeing a commonality with all of these things. This wasn't just a Boston issue. This was an all of us issue. And so when the First Continental Congress came together, it was almost all of the colonies. I think it was New Hampshire didn't join in, right?
Mhm.
Yeah. And I think just the fact that they met together was an important thing. But this was not designed to try to gain independence. At this point, the people that were part of the First Continental Congress, very, very few of them had independence on their mind at that point. They just simply wanted to organize some of these boycotts a little bit more, and they sent a letter to the king asking him to remove these acts. George III rebuffed this, but this was, again, not to try to formulate this full independence movement, but they were beginning to organize their boycotts, and they began the seeds of organizing their militias as well. And that becomes important with this next part. But I do want to kind of read you a quote from John Adams. This is him reflecting much later on. He said, "As to the history of the revolution, my ideas may be peculiar, perhaps singular. What do we mean by the revolution? The war. That was no part of the revolution. It was only an effect and consequence of it. The revolution was in the minds of the people and was effected from 1760 to 1775, over the course of 15 years before a drop of blood was shed at Lexington." So I just want to use that to illustrate that with all of these acts, that's really the ultimate effect of all of this, is that these the colonists, the Americans, as I'll begin to start referring to them, saw themselves as fundamentally different than their identity they had before. And so then we get to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. So these are two small towns that are near Boston, Massachusetts. And this is where they were organizing some of these militias, the Minutemen. Again, these are not formal soldiers. They're people that do their normal jobs in little towns. But they would organize every once in a while to do some drills and training and stuff, just in case something would happen. So basically, there was a report that from the British that there was a warehouse of weapons that was out in the countryside. So they sent, they were like, okay, let's nip this in the bud before these guys start, getting more of a problem. So they marched out a bunch of soldiers, well armed, to go and hunt this down. And they weren't able to find that cache of weapons, but eventually they were met by some colonial militia, and they lined up against each other. And then there was the famous shot heard round the world. And so initially with that skirmish, the British were victorious, but they had a long hike back to Boston. And along the way, they were getting kind of picked off here and there. And so it kind of, it's an important portent of the way that the revolution would be fought, really, is that when they went toe to toe, very rarely would the Continental Army be successful. But ultimately, the attempt of controlling large swaths of land with a hostile population is what eventually sort of depletes the morale of the British soldiers. So right after this is when the Second Continental Congress meets. So again, they still don't necessarily are organizing themselves with an intent of independence, they start off trying to do the same approach. Let's send them a letter. It worked, with the Stamp Act. Maybe it'll work again. No, it doesn't. And so that's the olive branch petition of saying, okay, let's try to put this back together. So just keep in mind, the battle has started, the fighting has started around Boston without the intention of the Second Continental Congress. But eventually, as things are progressing, especially after Bunker Hill and the Siege of Boston, that they start to see themselves as saying, okay, this is the path that we need to take. And so we'll pick up on the next part of the story with the Declaration of Independence, which was not when we won our independence. It's where there are some people that declared it. That was actually pretty much a low point in the war in 1776. But this is what I want us to start to really think about. And this is, you know, turning this into an argumentative idea of when did their colonial identity shift? And what policies helped shape that identity that didn't necessarily exist before? And I can't help but think about, you know, from these two sides, the misunderstandings of were there turning points where the colonists could have done something different to prevent this? Were there turning points where the British government could have done something different? Could we still have the Queen as our head of state? I wish. I hold the Queen close to me at all times. So sorry, Queen. All right. So do you want to say anything more to close this up?
No, I think we're going to end here. As always, you know, you've watched something, you're going to come back to class. What questions you have, make sure you're asking them. If there's things that you found interesting and you want further information on, those are great things for us to talk about in our synchronous time. Thank you for watching and have a good day.
See ya.